Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Dr. Victor Gao, who is the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, who joins us from Beijing. Dr. Gao, always a pleasure talking to you. We were looking at pictures before we crossed to you of that impressive parade in Tiananmen Square, and I gather you were there doing live commentary on that parade. I mean, what was the mood like? Describe it for us.
First of all, it's a very solemn occasion, but also very joyful occasion. And it drew attention not only for all the people gathered on the square, but throughout China, as well as throughout many countries in the world. And I think the overall message is very clear. China becomes a very powerful force, protecting peace and promoting peace. This is very important. China has declared that it wants to be on peaceful terms with every country, and the Chinese way of development is based on building up peace. But promoting peace doesn't mean that China will tolerate any other country to play a hegemonistic role against other countries, try to issue ultimatum to other countries. China wants to promote a world order based on equality of all member states of the United Nations, rather than allowing any country to dominate above all the other countries. This is the clear message from this parade.
Okay, I mean, for a lot of people around the world, and you've already suggested that there are two audiences here, there's a domestic audience and an international audience. You were there, Dr. Gao, so you obviously had a much closer view than I did here in the Middle East. But the images that I saw playing out live, and perhaps it was just the moments that I was tuned into, they seem to be having an exchange, and I was wondering to myself, what language are they speaking to each other, given that I wouldn't have thought they had one language in common? Perhaps you can enlighten us. But you see what I mean? I mean, that's a striking image.
Well, yes, indeed. I think that group picture was taken when all these leaders of the various countries walked up the rank to the Tiananmen Gate before the whole parade started. Who most likely would translate between Chinese and Russian. And whether there was also an interpreter behind Mr. Kim, I do not know. But I understand Mr. Kim actually speaks good, fluent French, as well as some level of English. So I think one interpreter probably would serve the purpose of communicating. So it's not surprising. They can communicate, and they enjoy that moment when they were both on their way up to the gate before the parade started.
Just listening to some of the things said by...
Well, I would say the greatest threat to peace and the future development of mankind is some country try to play solo, try to pretend that it is the sole polarity in the world, which is completely in contradiction to the world order established back in 1945, because the world order established back then was not for unipolarity. It was meant for multipolarity, reflected in the composition of the United Nations Security Council's permanent members, each with a veto power. That means the founding fathers of the United Nations actually were thinking about checks and balances with the aim of preventing another global world war, at least among and between permanent member states of the United Nations. Therefore, multipolarity was built into the origin of the international order established back in 1945. But the fact that one single big power, or the superpower as it calls itself, wants to play solo and try to divide countries into different opposing blocs, that is a recipe for disaster. And I think we really need to remind everyone in the world about the origin of multipolarity, multilateralism, established not today, but back in 1945. And the fact that the United Kingdom, France, China, Russia, and formerly the Soviet Union and the United States were all permanent member states of the United Nations Security Council really speak a lot about this multipolarity. We need to bring the world order, the chaos in the world order today, back to the original intent of the founding fathers of the United Nations.
Dr. Gao, just listening to you there, and also listening said earlier on today when he said China is a great nation that is never intimidated by bullies. Reading between the lines of what you're saying, reading between the lines of what President is saying, are you by any chance talking about the United States?
Well, I would say today's parade, the victory parade, most likely will be judged by future generations as a turning point in the world. Why? Because throughout this parade, China has demonstrated to the fullest extent possible that China now possesses the most sophisticated weapons you can think about, conventional weapons as well as nuclear weapons. And in terms of the conventional weapons, it is completely minimum on a par with the United States. And the United States no longer has any advantages over the Chinese military forces. In terms of the nuclear power, China actually has enough wherewithal to deal a fatal blow to any country which dares to impose a nuclear war on China. Meaning, China's military buildup is not for warmongering, is only intended for protecting peace for China as well as protecting peace for mankind. That means whichever country or blocks of countries or groups of countries in the world which dare to think about war against China will be courting their own destruction, because China only cares about preserving peace, protecting peace, whether the threat to peace that we have in mind comes from the United States or countries allied with the United States. It doesn't matter. China will fiercely defend the peace for itself, for mankind as a whole, regardless wherever this menace comes from. So I hope all the capital cities in the world will really listen very carefully, and they will check out all the advanced
and visions and testimony on that. I mean, I was looking at those pictures, admittedly on a television screen, and looking at these autonomous weapons, these underwater drones, the lasers. I mean, a grand display of power, as you say. And China says, and you're saying, this is all for defensive purposes. I'm wondering if it looks like that to people in Taiwan.
I think for people in Taiwan, this should be the moment of joy, because one of the contributions after defeating Japanese fascism was the restoration of Taiwan back to China, dictated by the Cairo Declaration as well as the Potsdam Proclamation. But therefore, the principle of one China and Taiwan being part of China was carved in stone as a legacy of defeating Japanese fascism. And who defeated Japanese fascism? It's the United States, China, and the former Soviet Union and the United Kingdom. We worked together, we shared blood together, we fought shoulder to shoulder, back to back in defeating Japanese fascism. And China earned its right to become a permanent member state of the United Nations Security Council on the one hand, and restoring Taiwan back to China. So for people in Taiwan, and many of them were actually descendants from the more than 1 million soldiers that Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek brought with him when he fled mainland China and settled down in Taiwan. So it should be their moment of joy and exhilaration, because the celebration we made for the war heroes and the 35 million Chinese who fell in the Second World War were their forefathers. Their blood was shed by their forefathers, and the contributions and the medals earned were their forefathers' medals. We are the same people. We are the same species. We are bound together by the same culture, by the same civilization, by the same lineage. So any Taiwan separatists who claim that people in Taiwan are not Chinese are kind of equivalent of saying that people in England who are English are not British by their citizenship. It's completely illogical, completely berserk, I would say. So I would say today's celebration is a celebration for the 23 million people in Taiwan. The victory we earned back in 1945 was the victory of the people in Taiwan. They deserve the full recognition as much as everyone else on China's mainland.
Okay, well, I wasn't alone in watching that parade today from the outside world. I suspect, I don't know for sure, that President Trump was watching it as well, because in the early hours of this morning, Middle Eastern time, he was putting out messages on social media. One of the things he said, my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America. I'm sure you saw that too. How do you decode that reaction from the President of the United States?
First of all, I think President Trump really thought too much. He thought about other countries conspiring against the interests of the United States. I always say, whereas China is always worried that if we do not have enough friends, the United States, especially the United States under President Trump, seem to be worried that they do not have enough enemies in the world. So I hope they will reverse this mentality. They will try to befriend as many people, as many countries as possible, as what we do here in China. Now, secondly, I would say President Trump could have made the right decision to come to Beijing to attend the September the 3rd military parade. We call it a victory parade because the United States really contributed a lot in the final defeat of Japanese fascism together with China. But also allow me to make one point. China started this war against Japanese aggression as early as in 1931. For about 10 years before Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, China fought against the Japanese aggressors more or less by itself, solo. Nobody was really helping China. And the fact that the United States declared war on Japan after Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor really helped accelerate and culminate the victory against Japan in 1945. But the point I want to make is, even if the United States did not declare war on Japan, the Chinese nation will continue to fight against the Japanese aggressor until every soldier on the Japanese side would need to be expelled from China. Why? Let me tell you, the Japanese fascism not only want to kill the Chinese people, they want to eliminate the Chinese culture. They want to completely obliterate the Chinese civilization, which has been here for more than 5,000 years. How could any Japanese fascist expect that the Chinese nation, including my forefathers, would ever tolerate such maximum pressure against the Chinese nation? No, the Chinese nation will stand up firmly, uphold their own sovereignty, defending their own culture and civilization. And the fact that the Americans really joined the fight against the Japanese aggressors was a blessing to the Chinese nation. We are always grateful for the fight, Flying Tigers, the Doolittle Raiders, who eventually landed in many parts of China, saved by the Chinese civilians, who mostly, huge number of them, lost their lives at the brutality of the Japanese aggressor. I think those should be the shining moments of history shared by China and the United States. So for President Trump, if he could have made it to the Tiananmen Square, he would be probably the guest of honor number one, on the par with President Vladimir Putin, and that probably would have done more justice to the celebration of victory over Japanese fascism. But the fact that he didn't make it to Beijing was a pity. And hopefully one day, President Trump will make it to Beijing when we next time celebrate the victory over Japanese fascism again in the future for another grand parade.
Well, clearly the world is a very different place today from 1945. But I just want to pick up on what you were saying there. You're saying that President Trump was invited today, but he turned down the invitation to attend the parade. Is that right?
I do not know the details. I think there were indications that the two countries were talking about President Trump's proposed visit to China. President Trump insisted he wanted to come to China on many occasions, sometimes very hastily, sometimes very hectically, for example. But whether China invited him for the parade, I do not know. But I'm sure the Chinese government and the American government have been engaged in discussions about when and how President Trump's wish to visit China could be satisfied. But the fact that he didn't make it on today's grand parade was, in my view, a pity. And sooner or later, I'm sure President Trump will make it to Beijing. When it will be, under what circumstance, whether it will be a state visit on the sideline of another international event, for example, APEC summit meeting in Seoul or somewhere in Republic of Korea, I do not know. But I think China's door to welcome President Trump's visit to China is always open, and I hope he can make it and really elevate China-US bilateral relations to a new height.
To summarize this section of the conversation, I mean, how would you say Beijing, your colleagues in the government in China, how do you think they would characterize their impression of diplomacy under this second Trump administration? What sort of words would they use? What adjectives spring to mind?
Well, I would say it is generally felt that the reliability in the world of today is the unreliability of President Trump and his government. The predictability in the world of today is the unpredictability of President Trump and his government. Now, this is actually very dangerous because normally for a very powerful, very large, very militarily influential country like the United States, we want to expect that the leadership of the United States is highly reliable, highly predictable, and always means what it says and says what it means when it says it. But it seems that the United States keeps changing, keeps jumping back and forth, and you can never tell what the United States is really up to. And for every utterance of President Trump, you really need to spend tons of time to really decipher it, to see whether he really means it. He normally say, I may not. I can do that, or I do not need to do that. So he keeps the whole world guessing as to what exactly he is all about. This is the danger of the world of today. I hope President Trump will be highly predictable, highly reliable, and highly trustworthy, rather than unreliable, unpredictable, a little bit capricious, and that hopefully will be changed in the coming years when President Trump remains the head of state and the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military forces for all the time up to January 2029.
It's quite interesting to see Kim Jong-un there in Beijing today, because President Trump has suggested that perhaps he will meet him again. They met twice during the first Trump presidency. But if they do meet again, they're going to meet on quite different terms, aren't they? Because we saw today Kim Jong-un flanked by two extremely powerful men, your president being one and the president of Russia being another one. I mean, he's no longer going to be viewed as, quote, little rocket man by President Trump, is he?
Well, allow me to say the real thing. For the three previous meetings between President Trump, 1.0, and Mr. Kim, the ultimate leader of DPRK, China provided a lot of help and enabled each and all of the three previous meetings between President Trump and Mr. Kim. Now that means China really wanted to see rapprochement between the United States and DPRK. China wanted to do whatever that is the right thing to make sure that President Trump and Mr. Kim will meet again. So that is the megatrend, I would say. Mr. Kim never operated solo because China and DPRK still have whatever that remains of the kind of defense treaty between the two countries. Therefore, from the US perspective, don't dismiss Mr. Kim, the paramount leader of DPRK, because DPRK does not stand alone, does not exist in a vacuum. DPRK has a lot of solidarity from China, and in more recent years, DPRK has really improved its relations with Russia significantly, pushing it to a new level of analysis. So I hope President Trump will meet with Mr. Kim as soon as possible, talk about peace, talk about change the realities on the Korean Peninsula, because there was only an armistice agreement signed back in 1953. There was never a peace treaty signed. And I think for stability to really become carved in stone on the Korean Peninsula, we need everyone's help. China, Russia, the United States, especially focusing on DPRK on the one hand and ROK on the other hand, and to a lesser extent, of course, Japan, we should all participate in making sure that peace will be everlasting and war should never be considered as a possibility for the situation involving the Korean Peninsula.
And just lastly, Dr. Gao, before we wrap up, I mean, you've used the word peace several times in this conversation. It's encouraging to hear that. And yet there's a conflict we haven't talked about. You know, Russia invaded Ukraine. Overnight, 500 Russian drones were fired into Ukraine, 24 missiles during the course of the night, striking mostly civilian infrastructure. I mean, why doesn't China show some of the influence it surely exerts over Russia and promote peace? Because that seems to be eluding all parties at the moment.
Allow me to make 2 points. I think during the Alaska summit taking place on August the 15th between President Trump and President Vladimir Putin, President Putin actually said one thing. He said, if President Trump were the president of the United States back in 2023, the war in Ukraine should have never happened. Now, President Trump, of course, welcomed this, but I think President Vladimir Putin did have a point. The war was very tragic, very much of a very sad chapter in human history, but the war should have been an avoidable war to start with. Now, having said that, what we need to do collectively is to put an end to this war. And China called on both Russia and Ukraine to stop the war from day one after the war broke out. And China has never changed this position. China does not have a vested interest in the continuation of this war. So we call on all the European countries, EU in particular, NATO as an organization, to really put their acts together to stop the war in Ukraine, rather than pouring more fuel onto the fire in this war, because the war will never end in the defeat of Russia. Why? Because Russia holds two kinds of different weapons in their hands. Conventional weapon they want to use to defeat Ukraine on the one hand, but nuclear weapons in case any of the NATO member states, any of the major powers in Europe, or before Trump, if the United States want to really go into war against Russia inside Ukraine or strike Russia from inside Ukraine. So the possibility of escalation from conventional war in Ukraine to a larger nuclear war involving many parts of Europe or even the United States or even the rest of the world should not be excluded. We should stop this war as quickly as possible. China is doing the right thing, and I'm pretty sure history will look back upon whatever that had happened between 2022 to 2025 and come to the conclusion that China is on the right side of history by calling for an end to this Ukraine war from day one and has never changed this position. China is still calling for an immediate end to this war. The world will be blessed if China's advice is really taken into consideration. And I'm pretty sure President have told President Putin the same message during his very high quality meetings with President Putin here in Beijing, as well as in Tianjin during the SCO summit.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Appreciate your time and your contribution, Dr. Victor Gao. Thank you very much indeed, sir.